talk to somebody who's backed softer border protection laws in this country forever and a day. His name is Ian Rintoul. He heads up the Refugee Action Coalition. Thanks for joining us, Ian. Why would we listen to the advice of someone like yourself or Richard Di Natale or Christina Keneally, people who have been wrong on this issue repeatedly? Why would we back your suggestions on this case rather than people like Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison, who have actually restored order to our immigration system?
Well, you call it order, Chris. I don't call it order. I think we've got a very systematic, cruel and punitive and deterrent policy towards refugees in Australia, which is producing exactly the thing that hundreds of thousands of people are concerned about in this Tamil family, without mentioning what's happening on offshore detention.
Yeah, I mean that's fine. That's rhetoric. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that might go unchallenged on the ABC. But the facts just don't. The facts just don't bear out anything you're saying. A cruel and a horrible regime here in Australia.
You can go on about the facts, Chris, but you very rarely stick to them.
No. Well, you know that Australia has a large immigration program, and we have a very large humanitarian immigration program. Per capita, always one of the largest in the world. In fact, on raw numbers, one of the largest in the world. So what you're saying about Australia being cruel and lacking generosity is just false.
No, it's not false, and you can trot out the things about the humanitarian program.
Well, you explain to me how anybody could possibly portray Australia as lacking generosity when it comes to dealing with refugees.
Well, because of that, you look at the tiny numbers of people that are taken in the humanitarian program. 18,000 people, 18,750 is the top amount that we've got in the humanitarian program.
Yeah, but you know there are only two countries in the world who take more than that, and
you can talk about whatever you like.
Much larger than ours.
The fact is that there are 2 million in Turkey, 700,000 in Jordan. There's millions of people in Iran. Very poor countries, much poorer than Australia, who are taking well over the odds in terms of the refugees who are crossing their borders. You're talking about the UNHCR resettlement program.
Absolutely.
That doesn't begin. It doesn't begin to understand, the refugee situation.
Well, so this is it. You're talking about you're comparing Australia to countries neighbouring war-torn areas where there are large settlements of refugees in camps waiting to go back to their own country. They're not being resettled permanently in those countries. It's a ridiculous comparison to try and run.
You call it ridiculous, but there are hundreds of thousands of people that reject what you have to say. The fact is that Australia does nothing like it could do, even in taking the people out of the camps who are not going to be able to go back to Syria, aren't going to be able to go back to Pakistan. And as long as 18,700 is a tiny number of people, it's that really internationally which produces a situation where people have to cross the Mediterranean, have to get to Indonesia, try and get to Australia. It's the human rights abuses in Sri Lanka that forces people onto boats in an attempt to get to Australia, and that's what you have to address.
Yeah,
and
so this is the point.
The minister turns a deaf ear to.
Yeah, this is the trouble, you see, because that's why this Tamil family end up being used by activists like yourself as pawns in a political game.
You're not using them? The front page of Australia is not using them?
It sounds like you just want to get rid of our border security. It sounds like you're actually defending the people smuggling businesses bringing refugees who can afford it, asylum seekers who can afford to pay the people smugglers into Australia. And I don't think any sensible person would defend such a trade.
Just like the Second World War, just like the situation after the Vietnam War, people have no alternative but to use people smugglers to get someplace safe. That's what happens across the Mediterranean. It's what happens with people that attempt to get here. If Australia didn't have a ban, for example, on taking even the UNHCR refugees out of Indonesia, people wouldn't even need to contemplate getting boats from Indonesia, to Australia. But they've imposed that ban effectively to enforce it. Peter Dutton goes to Sri Lanka, doesn't talk about the human rights abuses, doesn't talk about the situation that Tamils actually face, and then goes on the front page of the Australian or Sky News or whatever, and wonders why people are getting on boats from Sri Lanka to Australia. He talks about the Medivac legislation. He doesn't talk about the human rights abuses that are taking place in Sri Lanka.
Yeah. Australia can't solve the problems of the world in Sri Lanka, in Syria, in Iran, in any country you like to mention. What we can do is control our borders. Now, what we're talking about with this Tamil family is the mother and father arrived separately on separate illegal people smuggling operations. They've, of course, been cared for and looked after in Australia and been accepted by the community they're living in now. and at considerable expense to Australian taxpayers, they've had access to every level of legal protest,
not a considerable expense. Actually, the Australian government has cut off legal
Excuse me, just let me finish my question. All the way to the High Court, and they've been determined not to be refugees. Now, why should they, as non-refugees, get places in this country at the expense of other people who are legitimate refugees applying by the rules?
I think that raises a whole question about the fast-track processing system and the problems that are associated with that.
It raises the direct question of why people who are non-refugees should have places that are allocated for refugees. Does someone else get to go on the program, or is it just the Chris Kenny Blas show? Here's the question, Ian Rintoul. The question is, why should non-refugees have places that are reserved for refugees?
Why didn't the minister intervene in March 2018? You know, when he could have intervened, he could have provided a way for these people to settle. He's been willing to intervene in other cases, but he wants to make example of this particular family. Let's wait and see what the court actually addresses in the cases of Tharunika. There's a very good argument, I think, about why her case should be properly considered, should be put before the courts, why the minister should lift the bar and look at the circumstances, of the youngest child. I think, if anything, what's happening with the Tamil family explains and reveals the flaws with the refugee system in Australia and the kind of attitude that we've got from a government that's more interested in deterrence, more interested in punitive measures than they are in welcoming people who need assistance.
Let me try again, Ian Rintoul. Why should a family who have been found by the courts not to be refugees take places that are reserved in this country for refugees?
They're not taking any place, Chris, and that's the kind of myth which people like you put forward. They're not taking any place. The minister could have used his discretion to allow them to stay in Australia. There's no place taken, not in the humanitarian program, not in the immigration program. It's entirely up to the minister, to do that, and trying to counterpose that between refugees in the humanitarian program and people who come here by boat or people who come here by plane doesn't get anywhere. What it ends up happening is that you cover up the abuses in the system. You cover up with the fact that the Australian government doesn't do anything about the human rights abuses that are taking place under its own watch, and doesn't do anything about the human rights abuses that it perpetuates in detention in Australia, on Manus, on Nauru, the terrible circumstance that it's created by cutting off financial support to people in Australia making legitimate asylum claims.
So here we go again with the unfounded and outlandish accusations against me, the government, people who work on Nauru, Manus Island and all the rest of it. Let's get back to the basics here. You've just said that these people should be allowed to, this family should be allowed to stay even though they're not refugees, and you refute the fact that then puts people who are refugees further back in the queue, so to speak.
It doesn't put refugees further back in the queue. There you go again, Chris.
Just let me finish my question here, Ian Rintoul. I've given you an opportunity. So you are now saying not only that you want an open borders when it comes to any refugees who get to this country, you're now also saying that anyone who gets to this country and is not a refugee should be allowed to stay.
No, well, you can put all kinds of words in my mouth.
No, they're your words.
Particular circumstances about that. I didn't say anything about anyone can come here and stay whenever they like. Although, I've certainly got no objection to allowing this Tamil family to stay, and there's thousands of other people who are being held in limbo in the Australian community who should be allowed to say. That is what a generous and confident government would actually do. But no, it insists on the punitive approach to people who do need assistance. There are thousands of people that they know they can't send back to their countries, and yet they hold them in limbo here.
And
they're
just
not
finally,
taking anybody's place.
Just finally,
they could live and work in Billawheeler if the government would let them do that. And finally, I don't think you should preempt the fact whether they're refugees or not. Let's have a look at. There are good reasons why Tharunika's case should be looked at.
I listen to the courts of this land and the High Court in this case. Now, just finally, though, you're not perturbed then? It doesn't worry you? You're not concerned about deaths and trauma at sea and detention with news that 6 boats have now been turned back in the last 4 months?
Of course I'm concerned about that, but I tell you one thing, that almost every boat which comes here, the Australian government knows about it. There's no reason why there are deaths at sea if the Australian government were willing one, to do something about the human rights abuses in the country that those people are fleeing from. Second, to provide safe passage. If they can pick up boats and turn them back, they can pick up boats and bring people here.
As they've done, no deaths since the coalition took power and started turning back these boats.
No deaths at sea. Let's talk about Nauru and Manus Island.
Thanks very much for joining us, Ian Rintoul. Appreciate your time. There you go. That's Ian Rintoul, who heads up the Refugee Action Coalition. Lots of barbs against everybody, especially this country, but effectively saying if you're a refugee and you get to Australia, you should be allowed to stay. And also, if you're a non-refugee and you get to Australia, you should be able to stay too. Now, that would be lovely in the perfect world, but we all know that that just can't happen. That would create chaos and undermine this country. But we like to give every point of view an airing here on this program.